1 second. That was weird.
We may be live without intro.
We might be live right now. Something may have happened to our branding intro. Oh,
Hi everyone.
yes,
Can you
we
see
are
us out
live
there
right
in the
now.
world?
There is a
Okay.
branding intro, but it's not going to play because I forgot to select it. I forgot to turn it on. So there you go. You can't see it. There it is, right there. For a
Okay.
second, you saw it, but now it's okay. We're live. We're live. Okay,
Skip
so hello.
intro.
Skip the intro. We're live. We're all good. Welcome everybody. It's the Maple Syrup Show. Yay! And y'all are lucky enough to be on the very last Maple Syrup Show of the season.
Oh wow!
Usually
The
we
finale.
shut down. Yeah, no, not the finale, but I mean of the season, sure. But we
Season
usually
finale.
shut down. Yeah, that sounds better. We shut down for the summer-ish so that we can get to conventions and things like that and make all those things happen so that we don't run amok of other people's schedules of travel and all that thing. And so people can breathe and don't have to be on our show. They can make last minute prototypes. That's what they can do. Just like every other designer out there. Cool. So, hey, welcome to the show. We've killed the 14 seconds that were originally for the video that normally goes on, but we're here. Hello, David Thomas. I see you out there. And hello, hey, that's neat. Dreyer Inc. is talking to us, not George. How'd that happen? Fascinating. So let's welcome everybody here. We have William, David, and Connor. Can you guys all introduce, maybe, I don't know, this could be fun. Could you introduce each other?
That's kind of neat.
I could introduce either one of these gentlemen, and it would be long and glowing.
All right, okay. That's good. Connor, go ahead. Pick one person and introduce them.
So William Thompson is a fellow Cherokee like myself. He is an amazing game designer, a writer, a creative, a person who has helped me with Coyote and Crow, who has, as part of Absurdist Productions, has made a great board game called Paleo Vet, and is working on a new one that I'm so excited about that's coming to crowdfunding soon called Winter Rabbit. And David Plamondon from Pametaway Games is been a friend and partner to Coyote and Crow Games almost since we started. He reached out to me really early in my process of creating Coyote and Crow. He runs both a consulting firm that does advocacy for native for folks interacting with natives in Canadian situations up in Canada up there, and then also runs a game store that is highlights a lot of native designed games. He's also my fulfillment partner for my Canadian stuff, so he's been really helpful at helping me get my games, my American inventory up over onto the Canadian side of the border and helping them get those games out there.
Yes, that interesting border that's there.
Yeah.
Hey, welcome also to Curve Cut Games. Luke Parnell is here. Luke was actually on watching the stream last week, and he was asking, hey, can we talk more about Indigenous game design? And we're like, what do you mean?
Here's one I prepared earlier.
That's what we're doing this week. So he's here this week with us, and that's great. And David Thomas is saying that David was also a supporter of Paleo Vet, and thank you for that. All right, so who wants to introduce the one and only Connor Alexander to us then?
I can go.
Yeah.
So as Connor said, he is a fellow Cherokee. He resides up in the Pacific Northwest. He's the founder and creator of Coyote and Crow, starting with his smash hit Coyote and Crow role-playing game. He's also published a few other things, including the board game Wolves, Nasi, and has an upcoming expansion setting book for Coyote and Crow that's coming out. All-around cool guy. I've worked with him on a couple projects, and excited to do more of that.
That's awesome. I love that you guys are celebrating each other. I think that's a wonderful thing, right? Because if you don't, who else will, right?
I mean, pretty much that's what this show's about, I think, is that like there are a lot of things that we can complain about.
Right.
But let's celebrate some of this stuff as well, because there's heaps of cool stuff for us to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, usually what we do at this point is we ask you for your origin stories, and I think we kind of covered that to a certain extent. But I think what would be quite interesting is you've both mentioned, or two of you have mentioned, that you're Cherokee. And that's a different kind of origin story. I was wondering if either of you would like to put that into context a little bit for the people out there who might not know what that means in terms of how you feel in the industry and what your voice could mean.
Well, do you want to start, William? Or
Sure, I can start. So yeah, I am a enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation, which is a very different thing from just saying I am part Cherokee. I am Cherokee. I grew up on the Cherokee Reservation in Oklahoma. This has been like a part of my life and something that has been, close to me for a long time. Coming into the games industry, I sort of started in the games industry with educational video games. That's sort of my day job. But I got into tabletop games, and I never really had intended to get in with Indigenous themed games. But as I started seeing what other Indigenous designers were doing, and started thinking about the ways that my culture could really like impact games, not just in theme, not just in setting, but in like mechanics and the way we think about games, I started getting really interested in that and started building that into my games. Started thinking consciously about how I can build that into games. And that has really led me down a path that I've really enjoyed and brought me both closer to my culture and through the research I've had to do to make that happen. And I think it's improved me as a game designer a lot because it's really made me start to look at colonial themes in games and look at things in games that don't necessarily mesh with the sort of worldview that I grew up with, and think about how I can change that, how I can do that differently, how I can kind of create my own voice in gaming with that in mind.
Connor, does that sound like the sort of story that you've been coming, like does that sort of make sense to you? Is that how you approach things as well, or?
It's very similar, with the exception of the fact that I did not grow up on a reservation, and in fact, for years, the only Cherokees I knew were my own family, and it really took me a long time to start going to powwows and meeting other folks and sort of not just reconnecting with my culture from a research point of view, but from a human point of view, where I'm interacting again with other natives, and that took me a long time. And that's been one of the real, I guess, blessings of Coyote and Crow, is that it's thrown those doors wide open for me, and I get a chance now to interact with a lot more natives than I would have previously. So then I really felt like I was on a little island for a long time with my family, because I grew up in Southern California, and my family wasn't, my dad's side of the family was not very interested in either the Cherokee heritage or their Mexican heritage. That's a nice way of saying that they're kind of racist and ashamed of their own culture. But it took me a long time then to get back to my family members who did want to participate in that and did want to embrace that part of their culture. So gaming for me, I really love what William said there, though, about the idea that like my culture has informed my game design, and my game design is informing my culture. It's working back and forth there really nicely, in a way that hopefully I think folks can appreciate it when they see my games.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can kind of understand that from a game design perspective, but David, what from a game store perspective, what is it that you're trying to do?
Yeah, so we came at it kind of from a very weird direction. We started Pimento Way Consulting as a goal with a core mandate to support Indigenous youth specifically. We had a very narrow focus. We wanted to create a better future for Indigenous youth. So prior to the game store, prior to the consulting work, I've worked with Indigenous communities for probably about 10 years, doing various sorts of transitionary support. So working with Indigenous youth going into post-secondary, working with Indigenous job seekers. And I saw a lot of commonality in just terms of not having the same access to skills and comfort and integration into, whatever system they were trying to integrate into. And so for us, it was looking at ways for us to help build grassroots foundational support. So we decided we wanted to do that through youth workshops, and we wanted to incorporate tabletop games into those workshops to make it more interactive, to make it more engaging, kind of like what Will said earlier, and incorporating that education and that entertainment together. So that was more meaningful and more impactful. And then we started looking at wanting to develop kits for educators, for community organizations, for libraries, that would incorporate both the games and kind of our guiding principles on how you can incorporate specific games, like different games, into that work. And then we started looking at working with distributors to be able to buy those games at a wholesale rate and then be able to pass that on to those community organizations. And basically every distributor we talked to was very clear that the only way we could have a purchasing account with them is if we had a brick and mortar retail space.
So you made a brick and mortar retail space.
So we said, all right, fine, we'll get a brick and mortar retail space. We
Wow.
opened up a 2,900 square foot brick and mortar retail space. And yeah, so it was a very circuitous route. Palmetto Way Games was always something that's important to us, but it was never really part of the core identity of what we wanted to do initially. It obviously has become a really important piece of the work that we're doing. And this is very local, so it won't mean anything to anyone outside of Edmonton, but we're in a very high barrier neighborhood here, 118th Alberta Avenue. It's a neighborhood that has a lot of substance addiction, a lot of unhoused folks, a lot of vulnerable populations, and because of just the legacy of colonialism and intergenerational trauma, a lot of those folks tend to be Indigenous. So for me, part of the goal of the game space was to push back on that narrative and that stereotype of Indigenous people that happens in these higher barrier neighborhoods, and to have that positive representation and have that community space. And then to be a beacon for other Indigenous folks, either already in the gaming hobby or just existing in the city here and in this neighborhood. So yeah, that was our focus, was just wanting to be a positive impact, both locally and more broadly, like nationally and internationally.
So a lot of
So what if-
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
I
you
was
go.
I was just going to say a lot of what I've seen. So I'm Indigenous Cook Island Maori from New Zealand. I did not grow up in my culture, but I did notice very early on that a lot of the same exact things you just described. All the Pacific people who are living in New Zealand are often the ones who are in the lowest income areas, who are the ones most affected by all of the things you described. And what we've started doing in New Zealand is, rather than using the, I guess, lead culture to try and fix these problems, we've actually started going, hey, from the inside, how should this work? And we're actually, as New Zealand as a country, we're stepping back out of that and letting different Pacific nations actually look after their own people and address these things themselves. And I think that's something that we can do within gaming as well, really nicely. And so I love the way that your story sort of got around to that being about games, because games are one of the ways that we can connect without it being sort of, here I am making things better for myself, kind of, it feels very like ick. Yeah, I was going somewhere with that, but I forgot what it was. You had something, Sen.
Yeah, my question or my comment really was, again, David, when you were talking about the gaming community, and you were saying, trying to serve people who were Indigenous and gaming already, and people who were trying to get into gaming, do you find that gaming is inclusive of Indigenous cultures, or people who are Indigenous, I guess should be a better way to put that, in Canada, in Edmonton, where you are?
So I can only speak from my experience, but I would say no. That's actually been a massive challenge for us. So it's interesting because, very similar to Connor, I grew up with a large Indigenous family, but didn't have a lot of cross-cultural connections and very disconnected from the culture as well. But gameplay was always very present in all of our family functions. And it was, again, this was in the 80s and 90s. So it was Monopoly, and it was, Scrabble, and a lot of the quote unquote classics. But it's something that always was at the core for me in connecting with family, and family was indigeneity in a sense. But when we opened up Palmetto Way Games, we wanted to very much differentiate ourselves from other retailers, particularly here in this market. Where I live, there's I think about 15 dedicated hobby retailers in the greater metropolitan area, for a city of about just over 1 million. It's a very, very competitive market.
That's a lot.
And it is. Winter city, I think. So I think that contributes on a lot of, we get about 2 months of warm weather, and then it's all winter after that, and no mountains, so nothing fun to do. But we wanted to differentiate ourselves. And so part of it was we wanted to incorporate indigeneity into our who we are, to our core identity. So our logo is a 20-sided dice, but it incorporates the colors of the 4 direction, the medicine wheel, so the red, white, black, and on yellow. And we use Cree. So I'm Cree, Cree and Métis, and so we use Cree syllabics. So our name is Plamondon. It's a Cree name. It means come and play. And then on our signage, on our logo, we actually have the Cree syllabics as well, which is a post-colonial thing, but it is still reflective of like that early Cree culture. But one thing that we found is, or one thing we wanted to do early on was also be safe and inclusive for everybody, not just the Indigenous community, but the queer community, people of color, the Black community, newcomers. And so where we've seen the most success in terms of creating that safe and inclusive space that really has a need is with the queer community. We have our pride flag up year round. We have a dedicated space in addition to our Indigenous design and theme games. We have a queer section in our store that highlights queer creators and queer design and queer theme games. But to answer your question, Sam, we haven't seen a huge uptick in Indigenous gamers come through, which is unfortunate, and it's something that we're going to continue to try to work on. I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. I think that the work that Will's doing, the work that Connor's doing, and creating games that speak to Indigenous people, that represent Indigenous culture, is helping build that cycle of saying Indigenous people do belong in this hobby and that they have a space in this hobby. But I think it's a slow going thing. I think that, and again, like my work is historically a little bit different in terms of like, I do a lot of work in the game industry, but it's in a very narrow slice. I'm not a creative like Connor and Will, but I do a lot of work outside of games, and I do a lot of work in inclusivity and understanding the historical impacts of colonization and how that breaks it, how to work towards breaking those cycles of intergenerational trauma and exclusion. And Indigenous people have just been excluded from everything, economic cycles, housing, wealth development, education, business, and gaming, right? And it's one of those things that like we're not going to fix that overnight. Like it's going to be generational. And the work that Connor and Will are doing are helping break those generational cycles and say, these are our stories. This is who we are, and this is not just for us, but it's more for us than anything else historically has been for us.
I mean, board games in general, we have to accept this is a luxury, right? Having the time to be able to play. That's often one of the reasons that it's also very much men who play, because generally women don't have the luxury of that time, because traditionally women are doing all the childcare, which means the only thing they have time to do is look after children and play children's level games. So it's another of those sort of barriers in the way. And I know a lot of my friends who are Pacific Islanders, for example, consider board games to be white people stuff. That's how they say it. That's white people stuff. I don't do, I don't have time for white people stuff. I'm going to go and, I've got 3 jobs or whatever it is. And I think having games that actually talk to those people directly and say, hey, this is part of our conversation. That means, hey, you can come to this table because this table has us at it. It's not another colonial themed game. It's not another thinly veiled colonial themed game. This is actually, something where it's about us. It's our stories. So I know that both Will and Connor, you've been telling those stories. What's it been? I mean, even just when I was doing a quick Google, Connor, I saw about half the articles that were coming up were, Coyote and Crow has failed and blah, 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 and all of these kind of, like, it's about, it's a crap game because it's not, white people enough kind of.
Yeah.
How does that feel?
How did it fail? It did really well.
No, it's like how it's failed to represent everyone because it excludes white people from the story. And I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure this? I think
my favorite one in that one is that I've seen so many people say that my book explicitly says that all white people were killed in the book, and I'm like, white people are not even mentioned in the book. Like they're just not discussed. I don't understand that.
That's the problem. They're that fragile. You have to put them at the front.
Yes, no, exactly. I had a number of people too suggest that like I could have had a chapter on how Indigenous people went and visited Europe, and I'm like, you really just have to find a way to include white people in it, don't you? You just have to.
Right.
It can
so
just not be.
For people out there who don't know what Coyote and Crow is, do yourself a favor and go look it up, maybe even buy it, maybe even do what I did and buy a bunch of copies to give away to other people. Because that was that. By the way, if you are out there and you run a Kickstarter campaign and you say, hey, You could buy 2 of them, and I'll give one of them to like a library, a children's center, a youth group, a church, even a church,
Should have done that.
I will buy 2
You're right.
copies. I might even buy 3 copies. Anyway, so do yourself a favor, go look it up. It is basically, I don't know, Connor, what would you call it? Like Indigenous futurism?
Yeah, Indigenous futurism, science fantasy, an alternate history where an alternate future where the Americas were never colonized. So it's just a setting that empowers, I think, natives to tell their own science fantasy tales without having to worry about all of the backdrop and history of those genres being sort of taken over by European fantasies and European tropes.
Yeah,
And
so like think Wakanda, but over in America. The
Yeah.
Americas,
A little
or
bit.
Turtle Island, whatever we're gonna call this place, right?
David just said Indigipunk, which I thought was
Yeah,
kind of
that's a
neat.
great
Yeah,
word.
that's a
Indigipunk's
cool,
a great
word.
Yeah.
thing to call it. Yeah.
We're just gonna call up some nice comments that are coming on the chat. They're not comments like what you got on some other things there, Connor. But Genesis Media Spin is saying, I look up to you guys, and they say that I believe you are doing such great work for Indigenous representation, which is wonderful. I did want to ask a question because I think this came up, Curve Cut Games, when I was asking David about, is there an uptick in Indigenous gamers? And Curve Cut asked this game, his name is Luke. Luke asked, if you're making a game for your community, very specifically your community, what weight do you think it should be? And should you use familiar mechanics? And so I'm going to pose that question to William, who hasn't spoken a lot yet. So
Right.
what do you think, William?
So
if
this
you're
is-
making a game?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. I thought about it with PaleoVet. I've been thinking about it a lot with my upcoming Winter Rabbit, and yeah, I think we do have to. Okay, so for Winter Rabbit, I've definitely wanted to take into account the community. I want to take into account the Cherokees and the broader Indigenous community, but I also wanted to make it accessible, and so we've done a lot of work to balance that, to make it accurate and authentic, to have a lot of details in there that Cherokees will recognize and understand as being just little things that are part of the culture, right? The score tracker and the turn tracker go counterclockwise instead of clockwise because that's the way our ceremonies go around the fire. These little details that somebody that's Cherokee might pick up on, but somebody who's not might not. But there's a little note in the rule book that says why.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool. So you can learn from it as well. That's nice. I like that.
Working with my business partner, Dave, who does my development, he's helped me recognize certain things that I've gotten too specific, right? I've gotten so into the culture that maybe somebody who's not part of that culture goes, I don't understand that. You need to explain it a little bit more. And we don't take those things out. We just give a little bit more scaffolding, a little bit more explanation, and get it in there too. Another really important thing that we've decided to do with this game is to make it playable in the language. So we are actually including another deck of cards in the box that will be in Cherokee, and the backs of some of the components are in Cherokee instead of English, and there's a Cherokee rulebook. So you can actually play Winter Rabbit in Cherokee or English. It's there, right? And we're trying to give that equal weight to the English. I know, maybe there are many fewer people who will play it in Cherokee. Hopefully there's a lot of them, but it will have equal weight to the English version so that it's there, right? And I think that's very important because the language needs to be represented, right? Even if people are learning it, even if they don't speak it, seeing the written Sequoian alphabet there on the components, I think is a very important thing. And that's very different from having a language independent game, right? This is a language independent game that has extra components in the box that are in the language. And I think that's a very important step to making it for the community, but also taking those notes to make it for the broader audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you please have links from those things somehow to someone saying them?
Yeah, sure.
In some way, because I think that's very. I mean, actually understanding how to speak a language. These languages started out as just
Right.
spoken anyway, right? So that spoken part feels to me like it's pretty important. And
I will get some of that. We have a language teacher who's doing the translations right now. Once we have some of that, I'll get some recordings. I'm a learner. I'm doing my best to work on learning the language, but it is about as different from English as a language can possibly be, and so it is a very, very slow process. So I don't think my accent would do it justice, but I will definitely try to find somebody who can read some of those portions and record that so that we can hear it. Yeah, that sounds good.
And that's amazing to me. That is wonderful, because I don't think people understand what, colonialism has done, right? In terms of like just the destruction of languages, like the mass destruction of culture that happens when people are uprooted, their houses, their spaces are taken away from them, and they're all shoved into this other place. Go live over there.
Right.
And your name is now Bob, and yours is Rachel.
Somebody gave me a good analogy that, like, it's not just you're forgetting everything that existed because you're moving to a different place that doesn't
all
have
the points of references. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And we are the Indigenous people across the world trying so very hard to not only hold on to what exists, but to rebuild and recreate and spread the language and language programs. And our communities and our tribal governments and things are doing a lot of work to do that, to spread the language and having extra things like this, right? So I've talked to people who work in language departments and stuff who are like, I just want to have a copy of the game so that people can play it, right, in my classes or in my program, just so it can be there and people can have that and play it in the language. And having more of those artifacts around, I think, is great, and it helps those efforts in decolonizing, because we're all of us, every person who has Indigenous heritage, we're all working to decolonize, right? We're all working to like think about things differently, to understand and connect with our communities and that ancestral knowledge and all those ways, and it's a lifelong process, right? That's where we are, and that's a lifelong process. And every little thing we can do to create to help that, I think, is important.
And so much of it has been lost, and there's only so much we can do. But what we can do is we can build as much as we can from what we've got, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point out that, like, it's not just what's lost. Like our cultures have continued to live and have continued to change and continue to develop, right? The Cherokee alphabet was invented in the 1830s, and that doesn't make it any less unique or important than if it was something made before colonization, right? It's Cherokee design and fashion and film, and all of these things are continuing to develop in their own unique and really cool ways. People are doing really awesome stuff in all of the arts.
Yeah, and all of that needs to be celebrated, right?
Yeah.
Like that evolution of the culture, yes, it has been diluted. Yes, it has been attacked. Yes, it has been, like, all of these things have happened to our cultures, right? But at the same time, we still exist. We're still here. We still have our voices, and we're still making our things. We're making them from our perspectives. And that, I think, is a really important thing. Because I see a lot of people going, oh, but you did this in English language, or you did this, using a medium that is considered traditionally for white people, like board games or whatever. Whatever, man. Like, this is what I wanted to do. This is my way of doing my thing. Yeah. Like, if you're so upset about it, go that way. But this is what I'm doing as a self-proclaimed Indigenous person. This is my thing. If you don't like it, okay.
There's other things to do.
I got asked in an interview just yesterday, actually, about the fact that my upcoming expansion for Coyote and Crow deals with a lot of like horror and mystery, and the question had to do with like, what sort of Indigenous history am I tapping into? And I said, actually, I'm not, because I don't need to. Like, Indigenous horror lives now. Like, go to a Barnes and Noble and pick up a Stephen Graham Jones novel. You'll find some great modern Indigenous horror that doesn't necessarily need, I mean, some of it does, but some of it doesn't tap into, Indigenous horror or folklore or mythology. I'm a Cherokee and I'm making a horror. That makes it horror, Indigenous horror, right? Like, we live in the now as well as in the past. And that's one of the things that I think has been most frustrating for me as a game designer, is that so often times I hear from non-native folks, oh, well, like this whole idea of like, oh, well, you're making a historical game or you're making a historical commentary. I'm like, no, I'm making a game. And yes, sometimes it speaks to Indigenous people because I want to be inclusive, but we're just making games, right? Like we're designing games, and they don't have to always be a lesson for, especially for white people. They don't have to be a lesson for white people.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's not. That's, I think, one of the things that I've noticed a lot is that if it's not there to teach white people, and I just did it. I was like, oh, can you make sure that you have someone saying the words so that I can learn from it? Channeling the white people thing. But it's true though, right? Like, oh, teach me your culture. No, how about you get to just celebrate your culture?
Yeah.
How about you just get to do the thing? So,
David, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that, like what Connor was saying, really touches on something that I really try to keep in mind as well, is that, your indigeneity doesn't have to be the crux of what you're doing as a professional, as a creative, as an artist. Like, I always look at like Marvel's Echo, right? And I think that's a fantastic show. And I think the cultural consultation and the fact that the character's indigeneity is so important to the story that they're telling. But also, like, why can't we have an Indigenous Captain America or like an Indigenous war machine, right? Like, why does the indigeneity have to be the defining factor of those characters all the time? Like, that's the problem too. And I think that's kind of Connor's point, right? It doesn't have to be Indigenous horror because it has a Wendigo in it or it attaches into, traditional cultural, mythos or anything like that. The fact that Connor is Indigenous and is creating a horror setting or creating a horror content, whatever that is, whether it's modern, whether it's historical, whether it's cultural, it is Indigenous horror because Connor's making it, or it's just horror. It doesn't have to be Indigenous horror. It doesn't have to be defined by his indigeneity. Like, that's something that I always try to keep in mind. It's something, when I first started working in post-secondary and I was a student recruiter, and my role was to go out to Indigenous communities and recruit Indigenous students. And so I was an Indigenous student recruiter. But one of the
you're just a student recruiter.
Well, that was the thing. That was one of the messages from one of the folks who worked at our Indigenous Student Center, was like, it's great to have an Indigenous student recruiter, but why can't we just have a student recruiter who is Indigenous? Why, like, and I did, but why does it always have to be you're Indigenous, you go to the Indigenous communities? Why can't I go to a regular school, an inner city school, or a rural school that's not any Indigenous people, and just talk about the work that the school does, right, as an Indigenous person? And I think that's part of what also has to be normalized, is we don't need to be defined by our indigeneity. It's important, and we need to incorporate that. Like, I think, again, Coyote and Crow, Winter Rabbit, these are extremely important games, but Paleo Vet is a game about nursing dinosaurs back to health. It has nothing to do with indigeneity.
Example, right? Perfect example.
I mean, an Indigenous game is any game made by an Indigenous person, right? It does not have to have Indigenous people in it. It does not have to be historical. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. If it's made by an Indigenous person, it is an Indigenous game.
Yeah.
And Indigenous characters don't need to be, wearing feathers and beadwork and ribbon skirts and headdresses, right? Like, they can wear t-shirts and jeans and they can have long hair, they can have short hair. Like, there's no template for what an Indigenous character is. And, I got asked just by like somebody I met at Gamma 2 years ago if I would take a look at some artwork, and he showed me some Indigenous characters that he wanted in his game, and like they were just like in your face Indigenous, and it was just like, I told, like, they had feather earrings and everything. I was like, how about you just like put her in an orange shirt? She could just be a woman with like darker skin and longer hair, and she's just in an orange shirt or a ribbon skirt. Like, it doesn't have to be all this accoutrement, right? I think it was Thomas King did an article. I wish I could remember. I never read the article, but he went on tour across Canada. There's a photographer who went on tour. It was either Canada or America, and he wanted to take pictures of Indigenous people. And then he found people that are dressed like Will, that are dressed like Connor, that are dressed like me. And he's like, no, this isn't how Indigenous people look. And he brought costumes along and dressed them up in historical costumes to say, this is what you don't understand. This is what Indigenous people look like. So he put them in costumes so he could take pictures of them. And it's like, that's not what indigeneity is. And it can be like when you go to ceremony, when you go to powwow, when you go to a traditional thing, like, you're going to have regalia and you're going to have fancy dancers, but you're going to have the majority of people wearing t-shirts and jeans and shorts and
even at
the powwow,
right?
Why does the orange shirt matter specifically? Is the color of the shirt important?
That's a Canadian thing. So on September 30th is Truth and Reconciliation Day. It used to be Orange Shirt Day. So it was a recognition of one of the earliest speakers around the residential school survivors. And it is awful. I can't remember her name, but she was super. Sorry, I got a little emotional. I always get emotional talking about children in residential schools. But she was super excited about the idea of going to school. I think she was 5, and she was excited about going to school. And she had this orange shirt picked out, and that was going to be her shirt for her first day of school. And then she went to residential school, and obviously was not able to wear the clothes that she wanted to wear. So Orange Shirt Day on September 30th, we wear orange shirts in remembrance and honor of all the youth that lost the opportunity to express themselves and to be who they wanted to be, and lost their childhoods to residential schools.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Phyllis Webstad, who was the name of the student. She was gonna wear this shirt. Her grandmother gave it to her, I think. And then when she got to the residential school, all of their clothes was taken away from them, and they had to wear, specific uniforms. And yeah, residential schooling is a very, very sore point in Canada, and it should be for many reasons. And I tear up consistently when I talk about it as well, because I talk about it all the time.
And the U.S. as well. And the U.S. as
Yeah.
well. It wasn't just it was in the U.S. It's I think it's not as talked about in the U.S., but it was absolutely a practice in the U.S. as well. The residential schools, the day schools. Like, this was not an exclusively a Canadian thing.
Yeah,
I was actually going to talk about one of the experiences that I've done. David, you probably know about it. I don't know if anybody else would. I'm not sure if it's Canadian. It's the blanket experience. Have you done the blanket experience?
The blanket exercise.
Yeah.
So the blanket exercise is, I know a ton about the blanket exercise. So the blanket exercise is an interactive experience that's meant to recreate kind of the timeline of colonization in Canada. So very quick summary. They lay out a bunch of blankets on the floor in an area, and then everybody comes and stands on it. And basically the blankets represent Turtle Island. They represent traditional Indigenous lands. And then over the course of an hour, it says, okay, now we're going to implement the residential school. So we're going to, they're in some of them I've been in there, they give you like actual babies and props, and they say, okay, well, these are residential schools, so we're going to take away the children, and they physically take the little baby dolls away from the people that have them. And they say, okay, now we're going to, or before the residential schools, we're going to incorporate reservations. So we're going to start folding up the blankets, and all of you're part of that tribe, you go over there. All part of you go over there, and we're going to separate you. And it's just this physical interactive experience where you go through the reservation system, the residential schools, the Indian Act, the disenfranchisement, the removing yourself from Indian status. And so basically what happens is, over time, like, you have the entire room is filled with blankets, and all of a sudden you've got, maybe 1% of the room where everyone's kind of scattered. People are taken out of the exercise because, you died because of, lack of access to healthcare. You got taken to residential school and taken away from your family. And so it's meant to kind of be a really emotional experience. It's really, I think, impactful, and I think it's important for non-Indigenous people to do. But again, it's the Kairos Foundation that did it, which is a religious organization. So, like, I think that everyone has a part in reconciliation, but it's one of those challenging things for me as an Indigenous person, that it wasn't designed by Indigenous people. It was designed by non-Indigenous people. And again, it's incorporating, it's Canada's history, but it's I don't know. I would like to see more activities like that led by Indigenous designers and
White
folks
guilt.
that are
Yeah. I honestly, I have never seen as many crying white people as I've seen when that runs. It is super impactful. But there's also the thing that, honestly, I don't want people to feel guilty. I want them just to do something. That's what I want you to do. I want you to do something about all this.
Yeah, I actually have my thing with white guilt is that I'm fine if it helps Indigenous people get off the ground, as far as like get their message out, get the doors thrown open. But pretty quickly, I feel like we need to transform that. We need to transform that into appreciation and communication and
celebration,
lifting each other up and making it something larger than guilt. And I'm hoping that, like, folks like me and Will in the game industry, at least we can do our part within the game industry to make that happen.
To turn that,
and I think
I would be thrilled if just our efforts, if all we did was change the fact that, like, white designers just stop making Indigenous themed games without bringing an Indigenous artist and Indigenous designer on board in the first place. I would be happy with that. That would be a start for me if that's all I accomplished. We're still not there yet, though.
No,
right?
No,
not even close.
I've just, in the last 3 weeks, 3, 4, well, maybe a couple of months now, encountered 3 different games that did not in any way consult someone about Pacific Island culture, for example. I mean, you know, a lot of people don't really think of it as something that they need to worry about because, you know, you can have tiki parties or whatever, and that's fine. Deeply offensive, by the way. And I'm seeing a bit of a change. I'm seeing people actually going, hey, wait, maybe we shouldn't call them Red Indians. I'm like, yes, that's very good. Well done.
Yeah, don't
Oh
do
my
that.
God.
I mean, do not call them that. Yeah, don't call them that.
Just little things like that where I just saw someone have that revelation a little while ago, and I was like, yep, that's good. Yes, well done for self-correcting.
The problem
Unless
is,
you're
and like,
setting it in a time when that's what people were saying, and you are quoted like, and even then, maybe not.
I think the problem is like, for me, because I work in like outside of the game industry, I also work as an equity, diversity, inclusion specialist for a national nonprofit, and so I work in EDI, and I worked in EDI for 10 years, so I'm in it. I think Connor and Will would probably have a much different perspective on how much progress has been made in terms of that. Like, I got banned from. I've talked to Kat about this, but I got banned from a very public and Facebook group, a board game Facebook group that's been in the news this week because I called somebody out for a game called Netatonka, which is absolutely one of the most offensive games on the market for Indigenous people. And the conversation was, this game has absolutely just taken a ton of different Indigenous representation, regalia, canoes, teepees, buffalo hunting, and just thrown it all into a blender. And the designers were from France. And their defense was, oh, well, this is just a made up thing. This isn't based on any real world people. This is just a made up thing. And I said, it's absolutely taken from a bunch of different real world Indigenous tribes, thrown into a blender. And you can't just throw your hands up and say, you know, we just made it up. No, you didn't. You took real practice,
it's just
and
a
you've
stylized
erased.
version of that. Yeah, no, it's not, man. You're actually using all of these elements actually matter to people, and they have meaning.
Yeah.
And
I think that through celebrating these things and through showing their like, if you give people the attachment that you have to something by showing that to them in a game, I think that gives them the opportunity to bond with it in a way that they wouldn't through a lecture or through those sorts of things. I think that's a really, particularly role play games, I think, Connor,
if you do it in a culturally sensitive way, but in this particular game, this game basically just distanced it from some.
No,
I'm
not in any way defending that game.
Yeah, and the brigading that came out
from the inside.
Yeah, and then the brigading that came out, and the number of people that just said, "Well, this, you know, the designer said this is non-Indigenous, so it doesn't matter. Like, this is so we're just going to take the designer's word at face value." And like the number of people that just came out and said, "No, you're wrong. Like, you as an Indigenous person who are offended by this, you're wrong to be offended by this, and the designer did nothing wrong here." Like, that's the problem. Is so like I think, you know, it's you know, I don't know. I don't like to be super.
I'm so glad I didn't see that post just read. I missed that entirely, and I'm so glad.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen things like that, right? I was playing a prototype for a game that I believe is now published at one point, and there were two guys running the prototype. And at one point, they were kind of explaining their game, and they're saying, okay, you can go down to these planets. It was like a space sci-fi thing. You can go down to these planets, and you can choose to either kind of be the good guy and settle on this planet, or the bad guy and conquer this planet. And I go, well, those are the same thing. And they're like, well, no. And then like I tried to go in, and I could tell one of the guys kind of like was like, it like dawned on him, like he kind of got it a little bit, right? He was like, oh, and then the other guy just completely like brushed it off, right? So that was like a 50%, right? But it was something so obvious, like to me, that like, yes, those things are exactly the same, but they were like trying to like situate in this game where this is the good version and the bad version.
But it's okay because it's in space, Will.
It's okay because it's in space, right? If you take the humans out of it, if you're settling Mars or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean,
like,
Martians aren't the same.
Like,
they're not as important as us.
Right.
It doesn't matter how they feel about their land. We can just take it.
Yeah. If you're telling a game about colonization in space, it is the exact same thing unless you change the narrative of how the settlement of those places takes place. Like, you can do it, just don't do it in a way that mirrors how it happened on this planet, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
David, good comment. Most of my education was in Europe, and it took me a long time to understand European racism because it's actually dressed up in such a way that doesn't. So a lot of the racism that I've seen in, say, the US, for example, it's just straight up like, this is what I am. But European is very like, it's like benevolent sexism. It's hard to see it. You have to actually unpack quite a bit to get to it. And it's this exact thing where it's like, oh no, we're celebrating this culture. Are you? Is this celebration? So that I think that's one of the things that I'm really excited to see is people from the inside promoting their culture and showing us, all of us, the world, these cool things that we can actually participate in, and then giving us a reason to defend it and step in and go, actually, variety is really important. These voices are really important. We shouldn't be saying, shut up, the game designer didn't say that it was an Indigenous game, therefore you should just, not talk about it. We should be saying, oh, game designer made an error there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and that brings up, I just wanted to quickly mention too, a recent one for me that was the whole Cardboard Edison dust up with the winner of the Cardboard Edison Award this year, called Crowded Frontier.
Right.
They got some blowback for the very overt colonial mechanics of the game. I mean, the whole game is about taking up what they call, I think they refer to as virgin land or untamed land. And
that doesn't belong to
end,
anyone.
Yeah. And in the end, their sort of defense was as well, there are no Indigenous people in this game. And which is always so like, whoa, hello, hi. And admittedly, they've gone back to the drawing board. They apologized. I don't want to get into whether or not their apology was a thing or not. But like, what to me, the point of that, though, the most glaring exclamation point on that whole situation was that Cardboard Edison admitted, hey, we had an entire panel of judges review this, and not one of us brought that up. That's a blind spot for us.
Why? Why did none of those judges bring it up?
Yeah, exactly. So that's a pretty big blind spot.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe something about the panel of judges could be addressed.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I think like the things that David is talking about, David Thomas in the chat is saying, the number of people from Europe and games from Europe and European artists who kind of mash together combinations of things to represent what they believe is Indigenous culture in the new world, quote unquote new world, is it's rife, and it's easy to spot, right? Because it's glaring, it's art, it's in your face. But something like that, which is like almost systemic, and that's deep. That's a deep cut. You have to be really kind of aware of that. And it does, like you're saying, Kat, speak to the panel of the judges. I was like, maybe we need somebody with a little more, who could be a little more considerate of that type of stuff on that particular panel. So it's hard, though. It is hard. There's a lot of things. I'm not defending the game, and I'm not really defending the judges. I'm just saying there's situations where, it's unfortunate that that kind of thing happens.
I mean,
and I will say that's
honestly,
a good example too of where they caught the issue before the game was published. So this, I mean, yes, an award was handed out, but at least the designer acknowledged the issues and is going back to the drawing board and the theme, right? So that's something.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I really appreciated is every single time I saw that list shared, there were at least 4 people in the comments about that list being shared going, shame the winner was about colonialism, though. So I was like, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Wasn't me that had to say it this time.
Oh, we have a question. How have you balanced mechanics with cultural representation and integrity? Has there been a time when you have had to remove or balance a mechanic with something that you really actually wanted to emphasize culturally?
I'll start with a little anecdote, kind of answering this. A year ago at the Indigipop Expo, Connor and I sat down together and we sort of like talked about the games we were developing. He was developing Wolves, I was developing Winter Rabbit at the time. And it turns out that we had a lot of really, really similar themes. Like both of our the gameplay is very different on these games. I've played Wolves, it's awesome. And it's completely different from Winter Rabbit, but they're both semi-cooperative. They both have these ideas of conservation and cultivation going on. They like covered similar ground. And as we were talking about it, we realized we came at this from a similar background. We came at this from a similar, similar ideas, right? We like, and things we wanted to tell, the story we wanted to tell in the game was similar. We came to very different conclusions, but the starting point was very similar. And I think like, for me, that's what it is. Like when I go into a game that is really about Indigenous topics, I'm looking at those cultural considerations from the beginning, right? Like it shouldn't just be a dressing like dropped on top that is the setting. Like the mechanics need to also reflect that, right? The mechanics need to reflect the cultural ideals. The mechanics need to make you think about decisions in a way that reflects those values and those ideas. So like that's got to be in there from like the very core and beginning of it, right? And if you do that, and it's a challenge, right? Because we're so used to thinking of games that are like just built, just like a little capitalism engine, right? And thinking outside of that is a challenge. But yeah, for me, as long as you're starting from the beginning, like I think you can get there. And I think that like I didn't really have to compromise anything, right? Because like the core, the foundation was built on top of those cultural ideas and representation and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I 100% agreement with Will there. I think the only caveat I would add for my game Nasi was early in the development process. I realized, because for Nasi's a push your luck dice game, and I was trying to really pull from some classic games of chance from like indigenous culture, stuff like peach pits, sticks, things like that, but then also incorporate like a very common knowledge base with something like Yahtzee, like something that both native and non-native audiences would be familiar with. But really quickly, one of the first things that came up is, do I want to create a game that is essentially a form of gambling? Like, there's a stereotype there. There's a preconceived notion about gambling and some native folks, and I had to really quickly decide, am I in on this or am I not? And in the end, I decided just to go in on it. And I don't think I've had that criticism. That was probably a case of me being a little hard on myself in the design process. But I think Will's dead on in that, like, from the beginning, to me, my mechanics are informed by my theme and by my message.
Yeah, I agree that mechanics are a way that we can subtly and sometimes not so subtly communicate things. And it's funny because I've just literally the other day talked about like why gambling mechanics are supposed to be like okay. So I was talking with a game designer who has moved to Vietnam with his wife, who's Vietnamese, and in a lot of Asian cultures, gambling games are always around. They're there. They're things people do, but board games that don't have gambling, not. It's this weird thing where you're allowed to gamble, except it's illegal, but the culture itself doesn't typically play that many board games. So it's this fascinating thing where you find games from cultures, but they're typically not a pastime. They're typically more like, this is a gambling thing, right? So it's fascinating. But also, is there a way to take that and show that it can be used in a way that isn't gambling? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and beyond just like, casinos and things, right? Games like Peach Pit that Connor mentioned, it's a traditional, very, very old game that had gambling involved, right? And then things like bingo are even super, super popular, on reservations. So like, it's a thing we do. It's part of the culture. And, I think we do have to be mindful of the problems that can cause, like very mindful of that as with anything, but it's not necessarily something that I think is bad to put in there, like as long as it's done in a playful and considerate way.
Well, it's very funny because I don't know how much you guys know about Asian culture, but we gamble. We gamble a lot. But because we're the quote unquote model minority, it's not necessarily seen in the same way. Like all the opium wars and all that kind of stuff happened way far away. Like historically not that far time-wise, but geographically very far away. And so when you see, and there obviously was some opium problems in the Americas, but whatever. But when you see like Chinese or other Asian gamblers, they're always like the high rollers in the movies, right? Oh, we're flying in this bunch of high rollers from, Hong Kong. But we don't see that same representation for, Indigenous people who are doing the same thing. They're gambling. This might be fun. This might be pastime. This might be the way they get money. Who knows? But it's a very like stark contrast between how it's portrayed between the quote unquote, again, model minority. So Asians, if you didn't know out there, if you're not Asian, you might not know this, but we're the good minority for some weird reason. And I'm not
You
saying that
work
because
hard. You have a good cultural
I don't know.
basis for how you behave yourselves. You're
It's
all
very
doctors.
silly. We're very similar to everybody else. There are lots of not good Asians out there too. Equal amounts, I'm
Yes,
sure.
but they all do bad martial art things.
Oh my gosh, martial arts. Anyway, so we have more questions. Hey, look at that. Luke is asking, what was it like putting your first game out there? Was there any imposter syndrome? And I think that I'm not sure if it's imposter syndrome just as you being a designer, but maybe a little deeper, like you being an Indigenous game designer. Is there any imposter syndrome there?
That's a
Or
great
was there
question.
any imposter syndrome there?
You want to take this one first, Will, or should I?
You go first. Let me think about it for a second.
Yeah. Absolutely on both fronts. I've been working in the game industry for a while when I put out my first game, but I was also worried that I just didn't know enough natives. Not necessarily. Yes. I wasn't necessarily worried about blowback from natives. I was a little worried about blowback from Cherokees, but I was also worried about not being able to tap into the audience that I wanted to tap into. My game was for everyone, but I wanted it to speak to natives. And I was like, if I don't have connections in the game industry or within the broader native community or within Cherokee circles, how am I going to get this out there? And I'm just really lucky. I don't even know how to entirely attribute it because my game's good, but I was coming from literally from square one as a game designer. So I just got lucky, and I'm really feel proud and blessed that I've gotten as much coverage as I have and as much reach as I've had so far. But I still feel the imposter syndrome all the time on both fronts. I mean, I think a lot of natives do. City natives are kind of have that tug of war with res natives, and res natives have the tug of war with city natives. There's just a whole thing. There's a whole show we could do on that one, right?
Yeah, I was just about to ask you, is there that same? Yeah.
Yeah,
oh, it's real.
Absolutely.
Yeah, putting out Paleovet, I was very nervous. I was very nervous because it's a game that I wanted to be very accessible. I wanted it to be like a family game that also, people in game nights as adults would enjoy. I was looking at it from a different perspective, and I wasn't sure if that was something that was going to go over well. And I'm really happy with how it went. I'm really happy with the way people have gone into it. I think I've definitely felt more imposter syndrome with Winter Rabbit. Like this game, I have designed and redesigned 1,000 times. I've been so nervous that what I'm trying to do with it is going to work, that people are going to accept it, that people inside my community are going to accept it, that people in the game community are going to accept it, that I'm doing all of the things that I need to do to make it accessible, to make it culturally appropriate, that I'm going to put something in there, and then at some point some Cherokee elder is going to come in and be like, well, this is not right at all. This is not accurate. This is not what it's supposed to be, And I still worry about that, and I feel like I've done a really good job trying to cover all the bases, but I think that's one of the things that being part of an Indigenous community is it's kind of always there, is that you're always like, am I doing this enough?
Because you have to represent. You represent the whole culture.
Right? You have to represent
on your shoulders, William.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good point, though, isn't it, Sen? Because so many people talk about Indigenous as if it's just this one monolith.
Right.
And
gosh.
Yeah.
Each of us, not just our tribal groups or whatever we want to call them, but our actual families, our individual families have different ways of doing things and different traditions. And yes, an elder may well say, that's not right in my family. Cool. Okay. Yes. And you probably do have the authority over me to say that, but also that's how we do it.
Yeah, and a different elder might give you a different answer, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have never, ever done more research for a game than what I did for Junction, right? Which is about my own freaking culture, right? Yeah. I've never done more research for a game, and I've done some huge games, guys. Huge, absolutely bonkers games. And this one book I've never watched more film, read more books. I have a whole like library of books about Chinese food. And you're right, it did actually change my appreciation of my own culture. And this is another thing. I just said this the other day. It's like I never thought about, Americanized, Canadianized Chinese food well. I don't like it. I always thought very negatively towards it because it's not quote unquote authentic, and because it's not. But by reading all the stories about how my people survived through the 1800s by becoming cooks, it
And
was
adapting
just
to what's available.
exactly.
And
It's like, no,
what people
this is the
buy.
food of survival and the food of adaptation and the food of, of wanting to find a better future for your family, right? So
Yes.
I think that weird I don't necessarily feel imposter syndrome towards it, but I felt like I was carrying a lot of weight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
Is
that's,
the crowdfunding going on for the reprint on it right now still? Is that still happening?
No, it hadn't started yet. It's starting in like
Oh, it
21
hasn't
days.
started yet. All right. Well, shout out for that for Zhangxie.
Yeah,
That game is
when it comes out.
amazing. It's beautiful. It's incredible.
Thanks. That's all Quan Chai and Steven, the artist. They're wonderful. Sorry, David, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just gonna touch on the food thing. Sorry, you just triggered
Yeah,
another
yeah.
thing for me. That's a really sensitive issue for me. This idea that like indigenous cuisine is always tied to like bannock or fry bread, which is like a really big issue for me. Like we have, he's a great entrepreneur. There's a local here in our city that runs a place called.
No fry bread allowed? That'd be a great name.
No, I can't remember the name of the business. But anyways, like it's all bannock and fry bread, right? Which is like delicious, but it's also like extremely unhealthy and like only helps perpetrate like health issues that are already so prevalent in a lot of indigenous communities, right? And you touched on it exactly, is that it is a survival food, right? It's not a cultural pre-colonial food. Like pre-colonial food was wild game. It was buffalo, it was deer, it was moose, it was rabbits, and now like indigenous cuisine is always, the same thing as like Chinese food is considered like ginger beef and green onion cakes, right? Like that's not historically.
Oh, especially where you are.
Yeah.
Which is so funnily enough, that is very specific to where you are.
and
Entirely specific
delicious.
to Edmonton. It is.
Do you know what ours is? Do you
Something
know
that
what
Connor
a
did,
classic element of like traditional island food is?
No.
Tinned spam.
Oh, I mean, yeah, that. So I can go into. Do you guys got 4 hours? Because I can do a lecture on spam.
Right. I'll give you a treatise on fried bologna. Yeah.
And I can also do one on condensed milk if you want. So I love food, and I think it's hilarious. But it's so the colonization and food and the proliferation of it's such an interesting thing.
One of the things that I really love about Coyote and Crow is that Connor actually worked with a Cherokee chef. I believe it was Nico, right?
Nico.
To include some recipes in the book that are basically like cuisine as if it had developed with indigenous ingredients, with ingredients from Turtle Island. And she's got a restaurant. I've eaten at her restaurant. Her food is delicious and amazing. And I love that was incorporated into the book as like, this is what the food looks like, right? That's in there.
Food is culture. That is such a great touch.
Yeah. Language is culture, food is culture, clothing is culture, music is culture, all these things, right? And so representing them in game form or exposing people to these other sub things through your games, wonderful. Like is there a soundtrack for Coyote and Crow? Because I feel like there should be.
There is not. However, that is one of our stretch goals for the upcoming campaign.
Yes.
We're gonna have an entire hour's worth of music.
That was not a plant, everybody. I actually didn't know that. I just wanted.
That was not a plant. That was not scripted.
That sounds awesome. No,
That's
sounds awesome. Oh,
we have some more questions from the audience. If you guys have a couple, we're a little over, but there's 3 of you, so hey. Genesis Medius Finn asks, is there an element of your tribal lore or history that you have incorporated into one of your games that you're really proud of, and what is it? So, Will, I know the next game
Winter Rabbit
is Winter Rabbit. So can you tell us the actual story behind Winter Rabbit?
So Winter Rabbit is based on Cherokee animal stories. So this sort of group of stories are kind of fables using these animal characters, and I think a lot of different groups have something similar, right? Ours center a lot around Rabbit, Jistu, who is the trickster figure, right? He's our guy who gets into mischief and messes with things. So the story of this game is that we are all different characters from this lore, and we are working together to prepare our village for winter. So that's like the communal goal. But we are also competing with each other for basically bragging rights of who did the most, who gave the most, who provided the most. While Rabbit, who's sort of like a non-player character, kind of pops up, steals things. He doesn't want to work. He's lazy. He's just messing with people, taking things for himself. And so you're using that, right? So you're kind of able to mess with each other a little bit, or you're able to work together and do that kind of thing. And the game also incorporates a lot of the stories, a lot of these animal stories. So there's story cards that you can tell that give you a few points and also give some universal benefit for everyone. And each of these has a little snippet of a story on it. And these are all stories that I pulled from. So one of the things about like using stories in games like this is you have to make sure that it is appropriate to use the story, because certain stories are not to be shared outside the tribe or certain times of the year, things like that. I used all stories that are published and readily available and things like that. So and the animal stories are often very playful. They're used to teach kids and things. So I've got little snippets of these stories on a lot of the cards and a few other stories outside of that genre as well. And I really love that I can get it out there. And a lot of it's like not enough to give you the full story, but enough to give you just like a little taste of what it is. And then I've got sources in the rule book and stuff so you can go look it up. But I love that flavor can make it into those cards in a way that has an impact on the game. And I think that is a really cool just cultural element incorporated in there.
Connor, what about you?
My big contribution, I think, in Coyote and Crow was early on. I knew I wanted to create a fictional language, but I also knew I wanted some keywords to really connect and have meaning for me. And while we did come up with a conlang, a lot of the keywords like Adanadi and Suyata are based on the Cherokee words for those things, and that was really important to me because I kind of wanted to center those core concepts. There's some more stuff in the expansion that I don't want to give away. That's because there's so much in that expansion book is mystery, but there's a lot more Cherokee influence on some of the underlying characters and mythology in that book, and I don't want to give anything away on that one yet. But
I want to go back to a couple things that we've been talking about. So when I was talking about Asia, and I'm Chinese, but I'm my family's from Borneo, Brunei, which is next to Malaysia, and that's just near Singapore, and Indonesia's on the other side. And people understand, I don't know why, but they understand that if you're Vietnamese, you're different than Chinese and maybe different than Japanese and different than Korean. But if I said, I wouldn't say this, but if you said, you're from the Cree Nation, or you're from, Métis, or you're from, everybody would just kind of lump you all together. David, what are your thoughts on the real word that we need to use being nation?
Yeah, Connor and Will both talked about that, right? They come from the Cherokee Nation. Like when we talk about indigeneity, we like indigenous peoples is what we talk about, right? And we do broadly talk about Asian people, African people, right? But there's still that extra layer of Vietnamese people, Chinese people, Japanese people, South Africans, Nigerians, Somalians. But we don't talk very often about Cherokee or Cree or Dene or Beaver or Mohawk or any of the nations that exist. And I think that's a piece that at least where a lot of the where I come from in Northern Alberta, Treaty 8 territory, we talk about reclaiming that nationhood, right? And that's the conversation you talked about this earlier, Sen, about lumping people in and how it's just this monolithic indigeneity. Indigenous is just indigenous, right? But that's not the reality of how we lived, right? We were established nations that had territorial borders, and we had languages and cultural differences. The Cherokee culture is very different. Like Will talked about how in Cherokee culture it's counterclockwise. That's the exact opposite of how it is in Cree culture. We always go clockwise. We always go in that clockwise rotation. That's so fundamental to sharing circles, to pipe ceremony, to everything we do. So it's a small marker, but that's really the key piece that I think needs to be understood from an indigenous perspective. And I think that's the conversations that we're having, and and we politically here in my territory, and I think that needs to be front and center in all these conversations, right? And I think that's what Coyote and Crow did so well within the book and the fiction of the narrative, was establishing just very clearly that there are different nations, and Cahokia was an independent city-state, but there were territorial nations, and this is what they look like. And so, like, yeah, that's a big piece for me. It's a big thing that, like, I'm always trying to push when I have these conversations, is that Indigenous nations predate colonial forces, and this idea that, like, there was just Indigenous people as a monolith until Europeans came here, right? Until settlers came here. But no, we had just as much cultural and religious and territorial diversity as all of Europe, all of Asia, all of the, this wasn't just, a big lump of Indigenous people that all just came from the same language base and that, right?
Yeah.
So,
Like North America is freaking huge, everybody. it wouldn't be one nation way back then. And it isn't one nation now. There's like 3 different nations here in the other parts, and then obviously there's all the indigenous nations as well that we share that land with. So when I'm teaching about like contact languages, so I teach communication sciences, and I teach contact languages a lot, and people just don't get it, like that.
What's a contact language?
Oh, so a contact language is a language that forms when 2 nations meet and they don't share the same verbal
Pidgin
language.
English.
Kind of, but more so. Yes, Esperanto would be called like an international interlingual. It's a contact language. So, but in the Great Plains of the Americas, what happened was that because they all used a subsistence at the time, if they were following a subsistence model and following the buffalo herds, all these nations would end up in the same area, and none of them could speak the same language. And so they used it's not a true sign language technically, but we'll call it one because it's the easiest way to explain it. And they just used hand signals to communicate with each other because they couldn't. They were separate nations, everybody. Like when I say that language makes culture, it's just one major marker of a culture, right? That is a major marker of culture. And you can prove, like, this is the proof of the eating's in the pudding, that they were separate nations because they could not speak to each other. They are nations. Yeah. That's the way it works. That's how culture works, everybody. So anyway, yes, your point is very well taken, that I think it's very important for people to consider that these nations had existed way before colonialism, right? Luke is saying that he thinks that one of the things that annoys him about the appropriation of Indigenous cultures is that the people who appropriate have no responsibility to those cultures. And we, and speaking of you as Indigenous creators, take responsibility for everything that you include in your art, which is kind of the comment, I think, when William, you were saying, like, I don't know if this is right. Some elder might come down and like say, that was not correct, right? We have to take that feedback from our own people a lot. Whereas those French artists who were doing the art for Netatanka, it's like, hand waving, right? It's so interesting. Yeah.
One of my most hated phrases is "it's just a game," right? Or "it's just a movie," or whatever, right?
Yeah.
The things the way we design things, the decisions we make, have meaning in these products that are art, that are cultural products, right? They're modern 100%. Cultural products, and everyone should be taking responsibility for them, regardless of what theme they put on there, right? Even if it is a just a silly game about cats or something like that. Not you, cat, other cats. That matters. It matters to take responsibility for those decisions you really think about them. Yeah.
Your partner said that you've been digging into traditional vegetables and wondering if there's a game in there.
Nope, pun intended.
Yeah, probably.
Vegetables. Sorry.
So are you a podcast listener? Do you listen to podcasts a lot? Yeah. So Gastropod is one of my favorite podcasts ever, and there's some amazing stuff they have researched. They're actually like a government funded podcast. Well, they win grants to do these podcasts about science and science communication, and so there's a lot of really cool stuff in their podcasts about there's this one where they're talking about, I think it was this one. It might have been another one, but if I find out which one it was, I'll tell you. Where a lawyer from one of the nations, might be up near me, might be Anishinaabe. They are suing the state on behalf of the lake, that the lake has eminent rights, because the wild rice crop has decreased to a point where it's no longer available for actual harvesting, right? So they talk with people who are only around our age roughly, in their 30s to 50s, and they're saying just like, how rude, sorry, Kat. How many people have gone have noticed this big change in their yield since when they were a kid going out with their grandparents in the boats, and now 20, 30, 40 years later, just the yield is so much less. And then there's some other stuff about, and I find this so fascinating, about saving seeds and the seed culture, and how there would be a lot less plants if Indigenous people didn't save the seeds, as they were taken off the reservation, pushed into reservations,
Right.
taken from their lands. They saved their seeds, and that is one of the reasons why there is this new influx of genetic material into the culture, because a monoculture, by the way, everybody sucks. Like corn
In
is
all contexts.
corn is a huge monoculture. And if corn goes down, all corn goes down. Whoops, there I go again. But because of the preservation that happened through Indigenous ways of learning, that they could possibly save that if they need to, because they can introduce genetics that they thought were lost forever. But that seed still exists because the seed can persist over time and space without water, without soil. And so they're just trying to germinate them and get that genetic material back. So there's some really interesting stuff in there about food, futurism, indigeneity, and it's really cool. So I advise you all to listen to it. Yeah, and there's lots of game ideas in there.
I have.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's two things I want to.
Yeah,
I think that's such an important. Sorry, the idea of suing on behalf of the lake, I think, is such an important thing and so relevant to Indigenous culture, especially like as we move into the hopefully what'll be the death throes of late stage capitalism, and the idea that corporations can be entities and can be considered legally people. I think that needs to be the push that everyone, not just Indigenous people, but as the first people, as the stewards of this land, Indigenous people should be pushing for that. That if a made up corporation can be considered its own sole entity for legal purposes and persecution purposes, then we should be able to do that with all water, with forests, with all of the natural representations that were essentially, and this is a word. Bear with me for a second here, but this is a weird comparison to make, but they essentially are corporations. They were our livelihoods. The forests, the waters, the lakes, the rivers, that was our livelihood. That was how we derived our living. That was where we drew our cultural and community wealth from those things. And then you touched on something else, and that I want to touch on really quickly. Sorry, I'm going to get my soapbox.
No, go right ahead. Go.
The wild rice. So I don't know a lot about the structure of treaties in the U.S., but in Canada we have 11 number treaties, and it incorporates a lot of Canada's landmass. And I come from Treaty 8 territory, and in Treaty 8, the treaty was enshrined in the treaty. And this goes back to the idea of nation. That's something I'm obviously very passionate about, and I argue with people all the time about. The fact that Canada, or the Crown of England, signed on behalf of Canada as a fledgling nation, the treaties enshrined those nations, those Indigenous nations that signed on the treaty, that enshrined our nation, that cemented it in 1896 and in the different signings of the treaties that we were independent nations, that we were just as the same as Japan, as China, as Switzerland, as every other nation at the time, because we signed those treaties with the Crown of England. And in a lot of those treaties, we were promised that we would be able to continue to live as if colonization had never happened, that we would have access to all of our traditional food sources, whether that was fishing, whether that was hunting, whether that was agriculture, and we were promised enshrined in those treaties. And now, because of the environmental impacts, and sorry, that's what touched on with the wild rice, we can't live that way anymore. So Canada has failed to hold up its responsibilities as a treaty holder with these nations. And so I think there needs to be more legal accountability. Like, that's always the challenge, is that, like, and we talked about it at the start, Indigenous people did not stop existing when those treaties were signed. We did not stop existing when the residential schools happened. We did not stop existing when the reservation systems were put into place. We did not stop existing just because Europeans pushed us off of our traditional territories, just because disease and famine massacred millions of our people. We still exist here, and we exist in different contexts in different ways. There are tons of Indigenous people who live on reservations, who subside off hunting, fishing, and trapping, and they still do that, and that's fine. And there are tons of Indigenous people who live in urban settings and design board games and engage in business every day. But
It's also fun.
What hasn't changed is that there is a responsibility for Canada, for the US, to hold up to their obligations under promising what they promise us. Like, I don't know about the treaties in the US. I can only really talk about Canadian treaties, but there's a responsibility, and there's a responsibility to every single person living on Turtle Island to hold accountable for the economic impacts that are happening, like the seed libraries, the water tables, like climate change is something that I live in constant, like, just unending fear about, because of the unsustainability of our environment. And like, I just think about like how unsustainable that's going to be in the next 15 years when it comes to like water and food and like the fragility of all these things. Sorry, I know it's a big soapbox moment, but there's an obligation there's an obligation of these states to hold responsibility for the betterment of all of us, not just Indigenous people, but every single person. Like, that's the problem for me, is I get called out sometimes, or people try to attempt to call me out. Well, what do you want? You want reparations for Indigenous people? You want land back? No, I want this territory, I want this land to be sustainable for everyone. Before Europeans came here, before capitalism became like what it is, this monolith of consumption, there was more than enough resources to sustain the entire global population. I believe could be sustained on just the resources on Turtle Island if it was ecologically sustained and if it was equitably distributed. And now we live in this post-scarcity world, this false scarcity world, where Indigenous people have to fight for bare scraps of what was theirs originally. Like, where I come from in northern Alberta, we're rife with oil. Like, Alberta is like the Texas of Canada in terms of oil output and the distribution of oil and lumber. And Indigenous communities get scraps. We get little piddly offerings of jobs. Well, you can drive our heavy equipment, or you can, do teardown, or you can do wildfire fighting, but that's all you get. Never mind CEO positions, never mind shareholder, never mind equity stakes and the billions of dollars of resources that are extracted from our lands. But then when it comes to the extraction and all of a sudden that impacts our food sources, well, that's too bad. So they have no responsibility on the economic gains, and they take no responsibility for the ecological impacts. Sorry, that was a lot. I apologize.
No, that's okay. It's okay.
You're right, though. That's a really important, the kaitiakitanga, stewardship of
that's a
our
great word.
lands. That is what all of us humans should be trying to do. And to bring it back to games, that is also something that we can incorporate. I think one of the questions was about mechanics and things like that. That's one of the things. So my first board game that I tried to design, that's what I was trying to learn about, is the Maori concepts, and kaitiakitanga is one of those. And again, Will, as you mentioned, I have great fear that an elder, like someone's going to come down on me and go, this is not right. You've interpreted this word incorrectly. You're doing it wrong. And so that game is still back here.
This is why we don't design games in isolation, right? Like traditionally everything would be done in community, and even games, we have to collaborate. We have to work with other people. We have to talk to people. We have to play with people. We have to have diverse play testers, just like we have diverse designers. Like, we need all of these voices in there, or these things will get forgotten. And so, Kat, I encourage you to do it, and I encourage you to play.
I have involved as many, but the problem is, show me a single Maori person here.
Yeah, it's hard, right? I do want to just add a little bit to what David was saying before. So if you're in Canada, again, I don't know what happened in America as well, but if you're in Canada, I want you to go figure out if you are or are not a treaty person. Just go find that out. Just go figure that out for yourself. I mean, hint, you are. And you are bound by those treaties that were signed on your behalf by being a citizen of Canada. Because I have a lot of students who are international students, I'm not a history teacher. I'm a psychology professor, but I tell them about this because it's very important for them to understand what happened before and why they are afforded all of the benefits of being Canadian, which for many of them is like, so I don't know if you know this, but Nigeria if you looked at the life expectancy of an adult in Nigeria, you should go do that too and figure out what that is. And then go look at the life expectancy of a person in Canada, figure that out. You can also, if you really want to be very disappointed, go look up the life expectancy of an Indigenous person in Canada. Look at that. And then figure out why there is so much immigration from Nigeria. Like 30% of my students are Nigerian. Why is that? Kat's going to go do the research right now. And I really want them to understand, that they are treaty people too, right? That you are a treaty person. And being a treaty person means that you have responsibility, not just to the people you're in treaty with, but to the land, right? That whole stewardship that we're talking about before. And it's not a sore point with me. It's just the way I've always existed. Like, I hate the idea that Canada, could be bad at anything. Like, it's bad. Like, I love Canada so much as a concept, but it's like Canada's history is rife with all this bad stuff that nobody else in the world sees except Canadians. And we're pretty, hiding away from it as well. The world thinks of Canada as this very kind place. And I mean, it is, relatively speaking, but there's also a lot of, like, I'm not going to mince words. There's some atrocities in the past that need some correction. If not just acknowledgement, and we're coming to the point where we can't not, as Canadians, hide from it anymore. So anyway,
and we talked about like polite racism earlier in the UK. And like, I have a friend, one of my closest friends,
continental Europe, very specifically, actually. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Anything over there is just
benevolent racism.
I have a friend who's black and from Chicago area, from Gary, Indiana, and he's in Canada now, and he works for an oil and gas company here. He's an engineer. And he was absolutely blown away, as a black person who has experienced, a lifetime of racism in the U.S., how just open the racism towards Indigenous people was towards him, just casual, because he's never been privy to that, right? He's been the recipient of racism,
right?
But never been involved in those privileged conversations where
he's never been on the inside.
Yeah, and he was blown away by like just how acceptable that racism was towards Indigenous people in Canada. Like, as again, the first peoples of Canada, of the peoples, of the stewards of this land, and how just casually acceptable it is to just be racist towards Indigenous people, as if we're lesser than, as if we're not the survivors, as if we're not people who have survived over 150 years of genocide. Like, and it's just, we just get pushed under the rug. And I don't have a lot of perspective for Indigenous people in the U.S.
It's similar enough. It's like it's close enough. Yeah.
I almost feel like it's an invisibility.
In place to specifically stop you voting and things like that, right? Like, because you don't have the right kind of addresses. All of this kind of.
Oh, and I mean, don't even get them started on like blood quantum and stuff.
Yeah. It
Let's not. They're like, I could give like again another 4-hour lecture on a lot of these things from the outside perspective. So I can only imagine what Connor and William and David could talk about, just the history and the atrocities and all those things. And the funny thing is that we tend to dwell on that, but I mean, the most important thing that I've ever learned, like, this is literally quite possibly the most important thing I've ever learned. And it was from an elder. It was like, hey, until you say hello to a problem, you can't say goodbye to it, right? Mm-hmm. Until you wave hello, you cannot wave goodbye. And so we need to address these problems. It's not just a game, right, William? you know? And that's what people, when they say, well, it's just a game, they're not really addressing that problem. When you're getting banned from BGR, I know which one it was, for
I also got banned from that group for exactly the same thing anyway,
for speaking your mind, speaking the truth. It's not just a game. So
and it's erasure. Like David just put in the chat too. Like, it's cultural erasure. It's telling Indigenous people you don't exist. This game doesn't matter. This game cannot be offensive to you because you don't exist. Your people don't exist. You don't exist anymore. Like, that's the final stage. Again, I'm not a sociology expert, but those are the 4 stages of oppression. It ends up with internalized oppression, and it sends a message to young Indigenous people, to a young Connor, to a young Will, to a young David, that you do not belong. You don't belong at this table. You don't belong in this city. You don't belong in this culture, and you don't belong in this world. And that's why there's such a high prevalence of Indigenous suicide across Canada and the US, because we are told every day through the marketing, through the cultural representation, through the erasure, through the oppressive systems, through the injustices in access to education, to justice, to everything, that we don't belong and that we don't exist. And you talked about imposter syndrome earlier. Like, I'm not a creator like Tom and Will and Connor, just because it's not my skill set. But I will never ever let anyone make me feel uncomfortable anywhere in my territory, anywhere in Turtle Island. This is my land first. And that's not to say that, Cat's not welcome coming from New Zealand, and that you're not welcome, your ancestors, Sen, but this is my territory. And there is not one place in this city, not a boardroom, not a bar, not a restaurant, not a game store, that I will let anyone make me feel uncomfortable. I will not allow people to make me feel like I am displaced. Not anymore, not ever.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the work that I'm doing, is trying to create that safe and inclusive space. And again, not just for Indigenous people, for queer people too, but to make it so that everyone feels that they have a place in this hobby, and that they have a place in this store, in this city, and in this world. And that's the work that Connor and Will are doing, by making games that have that representation, by saying, we are here. These are our stories. Netatonka is not our stories. And no matter how many shitty people on Facebook want to act like it's fine to do that, these are not our stories. What Will and Connor are doing is our stories.
That is the crux of it. Like, these are not our stories. These are not representative of us, is what you're saying, right? And I think that's really what the important part is. Can they exist? Sure, but don't call them, Indigenous games. Don't call them games about Indigenous people, because they're really not, right? And they're
And don't try and hide what you're doing by calling them about made-up Indigenous.
Exactly. If you want to be a shitty person and make an offensive game, then be a shitty person and make an offensive game. But
own what you're doing.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, but own that. But own that.
Yeah.
Own it.
Yeah, 100%.
So, I mean, there's a lot of justifiable anger, and I know we have to look at that, and we have to face that. But that often makes it difficult to move forward, because you end up in that circle of just rage. And it is right to be so damn angry about this. I agree, and it hurts. But there are things that we can do, and I'm not going to be like all sort of, oh, let's make it all shiny and positive. But like, there are things that we can do. We don't just have to teach. That's exactly where I was going. It's not our job as Indigenous people to teach other people, but we can lead them. We can lead our own people. We can make space for ourselves by demanding it. We can make space for ourselves by sending our things out there and refusing to listen to the imposter syndrome. What other things can we do? Connor, you haven't spoken for a minute.
Yeah, to Raha's question, hopefully I'm saying your name, Raha, properly. I think the way that the average consumer or fellow designer, for that matter, when you're out there playing board games, especially if you're testing a prototype, and you see something that involves colonization or history of the Americas or Indigenous people in any way, Indigenous people broadly speaking, you could just say, hey, who do you have on your team from this culture that is speaking up for these aspects of the game? Who are your artists? Are your artists from these cultures? I think just throwing that question out is sometimes enough to kickstart the conversation or make the designer take a step back and think about it. And if it's not, then you can press them a little further and say, well, why aren't you using an Indigenous person for this artist? Or why don't you have an Indigenous designer on board?
And to be clear, you don't have to be Indigenous to ask these questions.
No, anybody can say this. I think anybody can say this. And it's just good, as far as I'm concerned, it's being a good play tester to question these things. Like, that's what it boils down to. And I think the flip side to this whole thing that I think a lot of designers don't realize is that good representation will help your game design. It will come out in your game design. It will make it a better game, and it will speak to more people, and it will be more fun and for everybody, instead of just for your little group that you think you're designing for. And that's, if you want to toss it back to capitalism, being accurate is good to sell games. And that, obviously the cultural stuff is important too. But if you're speaking to a non-native person who's designing a game, tell them that it will sell better if they're being accurate.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's actually, it's ridiculous to have to say it will sell better if, but really,
But
like,
if that's
there
what
is so
motivates
much
them,
more
then fine. Then yeah,
like,
go with that.
authentic. It sells. It sells.
Yeah.
Sure, if that's what you need to hear. Yep.
But
What have you
hopefully we
got,
get
Will?
back to the point where, just broadly speaking in the game industry, we're not seeing games come out anymore with themes that don't have people involved who aren't from those cultures. And I don't just mean Native Americans. I mean, like, let's not have games about French history that don't have a French person involved. Like, I'm fine with that too. That's great. I'm not going to be making any games about French history.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic because a lot of people like, and that's the thing. I don't necessarily want people to stop making games about Southeast Asia or China or anything like that. Go ahead, but just do a good job, right?
Yeah.
Involve
Yeah.
people, and it doesn't mean that you can't design it if you're not from that area. You 100% can design it, but at least get somebody to help you make sure that it is a good representation of that part of the culture, right?
Yes.
As small as it is, as big as it is,
Exactly
whatever.
like what we do when we're designing from something about our own culture, right? We do our research, we consult people, we ask to make sure that we're getting it right. None of us know all the things. Why won't you do the work? You can do the work. You'll learn something. It's great. It's a great way to learn more stuff. Learning is fun.
Yeah, I mean, like if you there are some really fun cultural consultation stories that I can get into, but people just make some weird assumptions. They're hilarious to me, because and the fact that they never got out there is the best part, right? It's like you're stopping people from just like shooting themselves in the foot all the time, right? That's what a lot of cultural consultation ends up being. Is like, and the part that I dislike is when people will use cultural consultation as a kind of a rubber stamp, right? To say, well, we got this one person saying yes about it, and their name's here, and so yeah, I have some feels about that.
This person is from France, therefore they can speak for France.
Well, yeah, but also
I worked with Sen on a game. Oh, go ahead.
Also too, I was just going to say, oftentimes those things come in at the end, and it's not, was this done right or was this done well? It's, is this offensive? I guess no, it's not offensive, but that doesn't mean it's accurate or that it's as good as it could have been. It just means you didn't offend anyone.
Yeah.
I got shown a game that had pretty much they'd basically used Wikipedia as the level of research they'd done on it. The person who was talking to me about it was like, "Oh, I played this cool game. It was apparently named after one of the islands of New Zealand." And I was like, "North, South, Stewart, what?" And because those are the three main islands. And he's like, "No, it's called Cowrie." And I was like the shell? We don't have an island called, it must be one of the really small ones. I don't know. Eventually, it turns out that he meant Kauri, not Cowrie. And it's a Maori word, and the pronunciation is Kauri. But New Zealanders who insist on not pronouncing Maori correctly will say Cowrie. It's horrifying, and you'll probably find that pronunciation if you look at it in Wikipedia. But they had not bothered to actually dig any deeper than that. And so on the back of the box and in the rule book, it's saying this is pronounced Cowrie. So this person who was all excited that he'd learned something about my culture, who came to tell me about it, just was like, "Oh, don't you know anything about New Zealand because you don't know about the island called Cowrie?" And I was like, ow.
David, you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I had the opportunity to provide a little bit of support for a game that Sen has coming out soon, and you touched on it exactly. Sen, I was apprehensive to engage in cultural consulting, and I always will be apprehensive depending on what the context is, because, again, I can't speak for all Indigenous people. Like, to Connor's point, I can tell you, like, the term Red Indian got brought up earlier. I had a Iranian hygienist one time who was working on my teeth, and in Canada, if you're treaty status, you have some limited health benefits, including dental. And he was really frustrated on behalf of Indigenous people about how Canada doesn't do a good enough job. And he said, it's really frustrating. We get so many patients that are, like, what do you call them? Red Indians, like you. And so, like, he didn't mean it as an offensive term. He just didn't have the language to be able to properly use it. Right. So for me, it's always about context, but I can't speak for every Indigenous people. What I'm comfortable with and what I want to see is going to be different than what Connor wants to see or is offended by, or what Will's going to be offended by. So, that's always a tricky part. But I'm also happy to provide my perspective, on what that looks like. And in terms of, like, consultation within the community, we got brought a game that was designed by a non-Indigenous designer. And he had gone to a couple different publishers, and they had referred him to us and said, "Why don't you go talk to Plamondon?" And it's a game about historical buffalo jump hunting, which is not a Cree practice. The Cree people, my people, were hunters and nomadic. We followed the buffalo and elk hides, or not the buffalo hides, the elk and deer hides tribes. What do they call it? Herds, Jesus. And so we're very interested in bringing this game to the market because I think it's an interesting design and I think it's unique and it highlights a very important piece of cultural representation. But it's not my story to tell. I can't just be like, yeah, I'm Indigenous, slap Plamondon on it, let's print it. So we've been doing a year of outreach to the Blackfoot Confederacy, to the Kainai tribes in Treaty 7 territory, because that is their stories. And there was a handful of stuff. And to the point that Cat made, the designer had done a fair bit of research, read a lot of books from non-Indigenous scholars and got a lot of stuff right. But there were a handful of things that, and talking with elders, with Blackfoot elders, like this is something that doesn't leave the community. And so no problem. That's removed immediately. Like that was the very first thing I said to the designer. I said, I'm happy to work with you to try to publish this game, even though you're non-Indigenous, but we're going to do this right. We're going to take this to the Blackfoot Confederacy. We're going to take this there and we're going to ask them, and we're not going to do anything with it unless they are okay with it. Right. Period. Yeah. Like full stop. If there's any issues at all, and to Cat's point, I can't go to every single Blackfoot person, across Canada and the US, but I can at least get, representation from the elders that I can talk to and do a cross section, right? 4, 5, 6 elders, community leaders, to the Blackfoot Nation.
Someone with authority to actually speak on it, rather than
does this game reside with you? And there might be Blackfoot people that are offended by it, and we'll carry that, and we'll have those conversations, and we'll own it if that's the conversation. But at least we can go back
because you did the work.
Faith. Exactly. Yeah. We engaged with the Blackfoot elders. We paid honorariums. We engaged in protocol, and we had a lot of conversations around it. We're having those conversations, and I know it's frustrating for the designer because we're slow moving on it, but we want to do it right. I think it's a great game, and I want to be able to have it. I think it's a very
interesting game. I like it.
Yeah, I want to have it sitting there next to Winter Rabbit and next to Wolves, right? And I want to have it there, even though it's not Indigenous designed, but at least it's got that consultation, and I want to be able to say, and I've seen great Indigenous games that have, that like Inuit, the Snowfolk, I think was a good example, that had a whole page in the front of the rule book that said, we are not Indigenous designers, we're not Indigenous people, but we engage with the Inuit people, we talk to them, and if you're interested in learning more about them, then you need to have those conversations with them and ask them if you can learn from their culture from them. And I thought that was a very respectful way of doing it, in a way, like, again, in a perfect world, I would love to see only Indigenous designers design games, but that's just not the world we live in right now. So, I think Connor made the point earlier, do the proper work, do the proper engagement. It's not hard.
Sorry. No, and that's a great point. The idea about cultural consultants that you brought up, that you don't know everything. I don't know everything about Chinese culture because I didn't grow up there, but I know a lot of people because I'm related to them who do know a lot about the culture because they did grow up there. And if they don't know, then they know people. And that is one of the ways that, a cultural consultant is just a conduit into the culture. They may not hold all the information. They might not be able to sign off on every piece of information, but they're able to probably access that culture to a deeper level than somebody from outside the culture can, because a lot of cultures don't trust.
And alert on those things as well. Yes, like, this doesn't feel right. This needs checking. That's already something that not necessarily everyone can do. One of the things that I hit a lot is that I don't have the mana to actually speak on any of these things. So you're talking about elders and so on. I don't have the mana, I don't have the experience, I don't have the knowledge. I can say this needs to be looked at, but then people go, well, why? Prove it. And I'm like, no. Or I've given you this gift of my level of knowledge, which is that I don't have the knowledge or the authority to teach you on this, but I can send you to the right person. So that would be a big thing. If someone from a culture points out that something doesn't feel right, don't make them teach you, particularly if they say, this isn't, like I'm Cree or something, like this is Blackfoot. Don't go, well, aren't you the same? Go, okay, thank you, and carry on.
Yeah. Or can you put me in touch with someone who could help me? Do you know anyone?
That's it.
And I do, for example. I'm always willing to put people in touch with people who actually do have the knowledge and the mana and the experience and the ability to actually teach about these things and to check them. But I also have the instinct that says, ding, this doesn't feel good. You should speak to someone. And they're like, well, why don't you tell me? I'm like, because I'm not meant to.
Do we have enough time for another anecdote as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the book I'm currently working on, the expansion for Coyote and Crow, it's set in a fictional town in the Pacific Northwest, and my original goal had been to very intentionally incorporate Lushootseed words. Lushootseed is the main language group up here. Lushootseed words, and I was working with a partner who is in charge of a local language revitalization program up here, working directly with me. And the more we went on, and the more I was working with him to create versions of these Lushootseed words, which include a lot of non-English characters, in a way that we could sort of work with them through the our conlang Chahi, so that players could know to pronounce them. The more he eventually came to me, basically he eventually came to me and said, "My elders are going to kill me if we print this as it is." And I said, "No problem. Let's just strip it from the book. We'll strip this entire thing from the book." And what we did was we came up with a great compromise, and that is as a stretch goal, he's going to do an entirely separate Lushootseed language companion piece that goes to the game that will have like auditory clips, phrases that non-speakers can use in their games to incorporate like common role-playing phrases into their at their table. You know, like, hey, this is time for a dice check. How would you say that in Lushootseed? All of those sorts of things, I think, and that was a perfect way to bridge that gap where everybody was happy, but you're still incorporating that aspect.
Yeah. Trust the instincts of the people who take the time to tell you something doesn't feel right.
Yeah, it takes a certain amount of humility, right? It takes a certain amount of humility as a designer to admit that you don't know everything, and to admit that you can just defer to another person, whether or not you understand why they are giving you the answer. Just accept that they know something that you have to go, you know. And I think that's whether or not you're doing cultural consultation, anything you're doing in game design, I think you have to come into it with that kind of humility, right? Even if it's just like a play test, right? And something doesn't work in your game, come into it with that kind of humility, being willing to accept what you're being told and change if you need to. It's very important.
And even if you're a long way into it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Even if you're a long way down, if you've done some art or something and someone says, "Oh no, this hurts. Please don't do this." Try and hear that.
Yep. And hire Indigenous artists.
Yeah. David is saying he's like just telling stories behind your back there. Well, we had a minor thing like that in reference to how we were talking about medicine. Very interesting in Winter Rabbit.
It was a funny little anecdote because I hired a culture consultant because I don't know everything about the Cherokee culture, of course. And in the intro to the game, there's a little story, and it's talking about the animals and how they use their different skills, kind of working together to prepare the village. And I wrote, Opossum knew where all of the best medicines could be found, and the first thing he noticed was like, "Don't say that. You can't say the best medicines, the best plants. That's very offensive to the other plants." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And so I just immediately changed it to something else, right? He knows where a plant can be found for each purpose. And it's such a little interesting detail. And I, thinking about it with my English speaking brain, it didn't come across to me, but somebody who is, a native speaker of the language and thinking about it from a different perspective, he picked up on that. And that was such a great detail to know, something very small, but something that I know probably other Cherokees might have noticed, right? And I'm glad we got it.
Yeah, there's lots of that kind of stuff when you're dealing with culture. So, in the diaspora of Chinese people, which has been going on for obviously lots and lots of years, it was really interesting to hear stories from Chinese immigrants to other English-speaking countries, and just understanding that, oh yeah, while there were people in, say, Great Britain of Chinese descent, like earlier than they were here in the Americas, the actual mass migration in numbers to the UK weren't actually until like the 70s and 80s of the 1900s, right? Whereas the migration to the Americas was 100 years earlier. And so when we released Jiangshi, we got letters or emails from people in the UK who were concerned that, this might just like raise up the racist feelings. And we're like, oh no, we're beyond that. In a way, it's like, well, wait a minute, it still happens in England because we're just kind of where you were 100 years ago, that kind of thing, right? So it's these things that you just don't know because you don't have the lived experience, even if you're of the culture, because the culture is not monolithic, right? And there's a very different thing. And you talk about on res, off res, and we talk about it the same in Chinese when you're like a mainlander versus Taiwanese versus Hong Kong versus diasporatic versus any of those. Your experience is going to be very different. You're going to react to things differently because your life experience is different. If you're from the mainland, you are 100%. You're the dominant culture. That's the way it is. If you're in Canada, you might get upset when some girl wears cultural dress to their prom and then starts bowing to everybody like it's a joke, that kind of thing. Whereas in like Chinese people, like they were saying, oh, she's just, she's, oh, I love
Playing.
that she's playing in the culture. I love that she's representing our culture. She looks beautiful in that dress. And it's like, yeah, but do you know what she did? Right. So anyways, lots of stuff. Hey, everybody, this has been great. I think there's a couple of last things. Raha says, great answers. Thank you. To be honest, sometimes my intuition is the designer slapping on a cultural theme as marketing, and there's no cultural consultation that'll make it feel right for me. That is a red flag that you should probably listen to, or at
Yes.
least do some research behind and see, did they? And then maybe ask some questions to them. Because, the funny thing is, like you guys were saying, is that this product may be done, it may be out, but we can always learn because it's not our only game. Hopefully, right? This is not our magnum opus. It might be, but we are going to make more things, guys. We're going to make more things. We can do better, right? If
Yes.
nothing else, humans improve with time, like fine wine, right? We can improve the next time if we're willing to learn, if we're willing to listen, and also if people aren't too scared to call us out on our mistakes. I think that's a very important thing. And so if we want the culture of gaming to get better, we need to be accountable, but we need to also ask people to become accountable, right? Troy
Equally.
says, yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. Just equally, just off that. One of the things that I've had feedback on from people is that particular game I submitted to a competition, and some of the judges said, oh, this didn't feel like there was enough Maori culture in it for me. And I was like, well, it's there. You don't know how to see it. That doesn't mean it wasn't there. There were literally like words in te reo and explaining that this is what was. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that
Did
it's
they
not there,
want you to go
and
like
it's not
do a
for
haka
you.
or something for them?
I mean, I don't know what they expected it to be.
Nobody's
but
playing rugby.
it was set in New Zealand. It had New Zealand food in it. It had the Maori words for the food. It had traditional Maori recipes. It was like, it had like cultural. I was like, I'm sorry, look, I didn't realize that you actually wanted a kapahaka performance with this as well. I'll just get my poi.
Haka in a box.
Oh, kapahaka is different from haka.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but kapahaka is the whole performance.
Right, got it.
The stuff the tourists see.
Oh, I see.
As well.
Yes. So, I think we're coming on 2 hours.
How dare you? No more tiki torches, thank you. That's not even the right word for those things. Tiki is this very special, precious. Anyway.
Right. We'll have a whole thing on tiki sometime, if you'd like.
No,
thank you.
I don't have the money to talk about it.
Right. I think that Luke his post is ending this very well. Thank you for the panel. And there's similar conversations in the Indigenous art world right now. And yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation still left to be had. I don't think this should always be, anger. But I think that anger is transformative, right? And getting it out and letting people know that this is something that affects us emotionally, that affects us in a way that isn't okay. And that should be what causes people to change, right? It's that they, not because we're angry, they don't want us to be angry, but because they want it to be better. Do you know what I mean? I don't think I phrased that well, but I think you get it.
Stop being so angry. It's so rude.
Genesis Medius says, thank you for sharing all this insight, Miigwech. Alex Wilson, great panel. Thanks. So excellent. on that note, who will we see at Gen Con? Because I'll be there. Kat will be there. Connor will be there. David and Will not be there. That's too bad. Not this one. Hopefully, we'll see you guys in person someday soon. Connor, I would love to catch up with you at some point just to catch it on Ludology.
I'm going to be in the BIPOC Lounge most of Thursday and Friday. I leave on Saturday, but I'll be in the BIPOC Lounge almost the whole time.
Okay, I will be there at some point as well. So hopefully we
I'll
can
try and pop in. I'm working for partly for Catalyst Game Labs doing stuff. So maybe I'll be able to get in and be like, here's some BIPOC stuff.
Yeah. Oh, David says that you guys are going to be at PAX U, which we
will be
at PAX David.
I'll probably be at BGG Con as well. So just not able to make it to Gen Con this year, but we're definitely hitting a bunch of others after that.
Very cool. Good.
And Winter Rabbit is coming.
Which one?
OrcaCon.
Oh, OrcaCon, great.
Yeah, cool. I will definitely
that's in your area of the world there.
I just agreed to be a guest this year, or this upcoming year, so I'll be there too. We'll
that's the only reason I'm going.
To see Cat?
To see Connor.
Oh, Connor. And Cat. Okay, good.
Cat and Connor.
Cat and Connor. all the people whose names begin with C. Raha says, awesome panel. Candace says, thanks everyone. So happy that she caught the show. Helena says, good to see you all. See you all. Great conversation. So lots of good people on the chat who,
awesome.
It's funny.
And we can see them
because,
on the snake.
Yeah. We love the snake. That a lot of the people on the chat aren't the people who this is actually for, right? But I think it reinforces some of the ideas that they can go out and help spread the word. They can. Some of them are designers, and some of them are publishers, and some of them are media, and so they can take that work and apply it to their own cultures and apply it to when they get a game and they're looking at it, or when they're play testing a game that another designer made. So, you know what? I don't think there's anything disrespectful in asking questions. Like asking questions is the way that we get along in the world, right? And we find out how people think and what they're learning and where they're going with things. So I think it's important to ask those questions and really keep people I don't want to say keep them accountable like you're the police or whatever, but to keep people to let them know that people care about this kind of stuff. Charles, if we can have this on Ludology, we will talk about something on Ludology, I think. And learning and acceptance are for everyone. That's a great one, Troy. That's you just paraphrased what I was trying to say out of this fumbling mouth because it's really late. Oh, hey, I teach in like a couple hours, so I got to get going. I love you all. We'll see you all later.
Yes, hang on. We need to do the.
Oh yeah, we need to do all these things. Yeah.
We need to
burn the fort.
Yeah. I just wanted to. Is it upside down? This is upside down.
Yeah.
And it's backwards because of my camera. But I wanted to just quickly mention this. This is nothing. I have nothing to do with this game whatsoever. But this was designed by Clee Bentley, who I don't know personally. Connor, I don't know if you've ever met, or either of you have ever met Clee.
No, we only chatted online together.
Yeah, same with me. So just a quick thing. I don't know how widely accessible Burn the Fort is going to be. I'm in a weird spot because we brought in 4 copies for the store, and I don't want to sell them because I want to curate them and make sure they always remain available for the community. But Burn the Fort is a game about Indigenous resistance designed by Clee Bentley, who, again, I never met personally, but was an Indigenous activist, a musician, an artist, and a game designer. And Burn the Fort is specifically a game about resistance towards colonization from a historical standpoint. And we unfortunately lost Clee in December of 2023. So I just wanted to use this as an example of we need more games like this. We need more games like Wolves, and we need more games like Winter Rabbit. But I just wanted to make sure people are aware of Burn the Fort. If you get a chance to try to find it, to play it, it's the perfect blend of an actually well-designed, interesting game, but also that incorporates historically relevant and accurate things. You are playing Indigenous war leaders that are historically relevant. You are pushing back against colonial generals who were specifically oppressing Indigenous people, and you're experiencing different Indigenous different aspects of indigeneity that's culturally relevant to the time. So I really think this is something that's special. And I was having never known him, but I was still heartbroken to read about Clee's passing. And I think just there's nothing better that we can do in honor of him than to play his game and make sure that his legacy lives on through it.
I believe they will be at Gen Con, actually.
Yeah,
I believe that's going to be
Princess's partner was
Yeah.
going to be there. Yeah.
I
Good.
believe
Yeah.
then I will buy a copy when I'm
And-
there. Or
and
maybe
will-
I
when-
got
when-
my copy.
And when can we see Winter Rabbit, Will? What's going on with that?
It will be on Kickstarter next month, toward the end of next month. I haven't announced the exact day, but look for it maybe like third week of August. Follow it on Kickstarter and all that kind of stuff.
excellent.
And Connor's project.
In Connor's
Yes.
project.
Yeah, what's that,
Yeah,
Connor?
What's coming up, Connor?
Ahu Tico, the expansion launches. You can follow it right now on Kickstarter. It launches next Tuesday. Super excited. All the videos are out for it and everything already, and we're all ready to go.
It's lovely.
As
And
both
you
a
know what?
gamer. Go ahead.
Seeing as we're talking about Indigenous designed games that are on Kickstarter, BubbleNet ends
BubbleNet.
tomorrow morning, 9
Yes.
a.m. our time. So
That
we
cover is
funded-
beautiful.
Bubble, that's
Thank
great.
you. If you want something that's just really lightweight after all of this heavy convo, it's just a happy little game about being whales blowing bubbles, man. It's all good.
As a gamer and a retailer, I'm so fucking hyped for all three of those games. I already backed BubbleNet. We will be backing. I've been eagerly waiting for more news on Winter Rabbit, and obviously, I'm going to back anything that Connor does.
There you go.
Hard same.
Perfect. Burn the Fort. If you're not going to be at Gen Con, you can go to burnthefort.com/store. They are not offering any late pledges or anything like that currently, but you can sign up on their email list for updates. Availability should be in mid-November. There you go. All right. So let's see. If you want to talk to me some more, you can find me on the X, Twitter, whatever, and Blue Sky at Senfeng Lim. Cat is at Dreyer Inc. on all them things. And you can reach both of us at Meeple Syrup. Will, what's your website, buddy?
Absurdistproductions.com. That is my website, and same thing for Instagram and Facebook.
Excellent. And then David, you are at...
I'm at PimentoWay.com. I don't do much on any of our socials. I let the younger folks who understand all that stuff. So if you want to find me, you can find me at 11805 94th Street in Edmonton. I'm here almost every day, yelling about colonialism and trying to shut down late stage capitalism.
Right, and go play some games.
In a shop.
Yeah. Hey, man. Start somewhere.
Absolutely right.
Consumerism and capitalism are not the same thing.
That's right. And if you want to be in the room where it
That's true.
happens, there you go. And then coyoteandcrow.net. What can we find there, Connor?
Yeah, all of our socials, our web store is there. All of the news and updates that I put up are up there. So yeah, all things Coyote and Crow you can find right there on the page.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And if you'd like to support the show some more, please let us know at patreon.com/meeplesyrup. Help keep the lights on. We are on hiatus as of once this show stops. We will come back probably the second week of September. Just give me time to ramp up my classes, and then Kat and I will be on the go. While we're at conventions over the summer, we will hopefully grab a whole bunch of new and exciting people to talk to. We also like to talk to the people we've talked to before. So you might see William, you might see David, you might see Connor again on this show. And yeah, we're going to get some new faces and new voices, because that is really kind of what Meeple Syrup is compared to, like, say, Ludology, right? Meeple Syrup really is, we can see people's faces, right? We can uplift voices, show people of color. We can show people who are genderqueer. We can show people all these types of things, which is really important representation. And having that, the video access is definitely different than a podcast, right? So that's what we're looking for. We'll see you all later. Oh, do we have time for final advice, Kat?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
Do you
okay.
have time?
Yeah, I have time.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing to talk about for next week, so we can give extra time to final advice. All right, I'm going to go in a row, and we're going to go backwards from Connor. Final advice, go.
This is just like general advice?
It
Like,
can
are you
be
sure?
advice about anything.
About
It could be advice about anything.
Yeah, but
Oh my
usually
gosh.
games, and in this case, maybe the topic of today.
Wow, you really put me on the spot.
I know.
Yeah. That's the
Oh
way
my
this
God.
works.
Oh my gosh. Here's my piece of advice. Always work with at least 3 different artists, because I guarantee you 2 of them are not going to be able to do what you need to do for various reasons. Always have 3 artists you can work with. at least.
That's an interesting point, especially when you're looking for artists from a very specific demographic,
Yeah.
because you might not be
Yep.
able to find them. But you got to do the work. Do the work. David, what's your piece of advice?
Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong anywhere that you are, regardless of who you are, what your background is, what your culture is. You belong. You deserve to exist, and no society or individual should ever tell you that you don't, unless you're Rick Santorum.
Also, this is why libraries are really important. They're the only place in Western society where you can just exist and use the space. Libraries are super, super important. Support your libraries. Will?
Support Indigenous designers, Indigenous artists, Indigenous writers, Indigenous craftspeople, and creators of all sorts. If there's people out there selling the real thing, don't buy a knockoff.
Excellent.
Don't get it from Temu, please.
Yeah, please don't. Please don't. Yeah, so you know what? Next week there is no show.
No show.
Apologize, everybody. We are on hiatus, like I said. We will be back in the second or third week of September, probably the second week, because I can't not do this for too long. I get kind of antsy, but it is a nice little break. So we'll see you guys out there on the convention circuit. I'll be at Gen Con. Cat will be at Gen Con. We'll see Connor there. Cat, are you going to be anywhere else in that?
Yes, I'll be at
period?
PAX West. I'll be at some other ones. Geek
Some more
Girl
local
Con
ones?
I'm planning to
Oh,
go
yeah,
to,
yeah.
but that's after September. Yeah, PAX West is. There's something else. I've forgotten what it is. I'm doing other things. I'll be
Other
at stuff. I'll tell you on my social media where I'm going.
Follow her on social media if you want to find out where Cat's going. Okay, so we'll see you all later. Thank you so much to our panel for coming in and talking about some of the deep stuff, and we'll see you
staying up so
all.
late.
Yeah, we'll see you all in about 8 weeks. Bye.